us. What we'll do today is I will do a few introductions, as it were, of the project. So starting with that, just to let you know that Katie and I lead an AHRC funded research network called Inheriting the Family. We are also draw on the expertise of a range of scholars, sociologists and historians, so Ashley Barnwell, Tanya Evans and Laura King, and we're based, as you can see from that, in the UK and Australia. And there's a longer version of this explanation, but essentially we're interested in inherited objects, and we're interested in the way in which those help people form identities, and that could be identities that would be from the personal through to the familial to the national. And I think emotions are the way that we are exploring those objects and their meanings. So we started in 2019. We had to pause because of COVID. We've had to change all of our plans that we had, which involved international travel. And we have mostly now moved on to online events, and we have 4 events planned across the 2-year project, which is now a little bit longer because the AHRC kindly extended our time period, and this is the 3rd of our events, and this one, as you will know, is broadly under the theme, the books that bring us together. We've had a lot of interest in our call for papers, so we have divided this up, obviously because it's not that easy to spend a whole day on Zoom. We decided that the most sensible thing was to divide this up into 5 workshops, and they run across October and November. They're slightly awkward. They have no particular rationale to where they're organised except to allow speakers to join us. So forgive us for them not being quite as regular or predictable as you might have expected. And today I'm delighted to welcome you to the workshop, which is Writing Gender and Family Life. What we will do is our speakers will each speak for 10 minutes. I will introduce them as we go along. And then we will save questions and discussion to once all of the speakers have given their papers. And what we're hoping is that this is a very sort of open forum where we get to talk about these objects and their meaning and the work that we're all doing. So please do feel free just to chat with us, and we can all learn more from each other. So I will just say that the workshops are being recorded. If you would rather not be visible in the recordings, please just turn your cameras off. But otherwise, I think we should probably get started. So we are going in the order, and I hope this doesn't startle anyone who's speaking today. We are going first with Hannah Upton, then we'll move to Sarah O'Brien, and then we will have Rebecca Sloan-Mather. So I will start by introducing Hannah. So Hannah is a first-year PhD student in English within the School of Literature, Languages and Linguistics at Australian National University, where she's a higher degree research candidate on Professor Rosalind Smith's ARC-funded Future Fellowship, Marginalia and the Early Modern Woman Writer, 1530 to 1660. And the title of her thesis is The Politics of Marginalia and the Early Modern Female Reader, with a particular focus on early modern women's marginalia in the British Library. So thank you very much, Hannah. And I will, if you've got a presentation, please go ahead and share it. And, I will now mute myself.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to try to share my screen. So the title of my presentation is The Family Bible and the Early Modern Woman Reader. And my original intention for this seminar was to discuss 2 different 16th century Bibles found in the British Library and can compare and contrast how their extensive marginalia contributes to our understanding of the communal nature of reading during the early modern period. especially texts as well read and well circulated as the Bible. However, in researching the provenance for these texts, it's clear that one in particular was far more suited to the discussion of family heirlooms. The one I'm referring to is a 1597 Geneva Bible owned by a woman called Susanna Beckwith. Written on a blank page at the front of the Bible is a note of how it came to be part of the British Library. It was bequeathed by the Right Honourable Arthur Onslow, Esquire, 1768. Onslow was a Speaker of the House of Commons and a big supporter of the effort to preserve books to be held by the British Museum. As he died in 1768, we can assume that it was bequeathed to the library in the event of his death. Most interestingly, at the back of the text is pasted a note written by Onslow himself detailing how this Bible came into his possession. The letter reads, "This family Bible was my mother's and she highly valued it. She was the daughter of Thomas Anlaby of Eton, Esquire, and owner of Anlaby, both in Yorkshire, not far from Hull, and her mother was the daughter of William Parker, MD, and Judith, a daughter of Roger Beckwith, the said county Esquire, and of Susanna, his wife, which Susanna was the person that wrote the words at the end of the Apocrypha in this book, to her eldest daughter by the said Roger Beckwith, who was named Susanna, and afterwards married to John Anlaby, Esquire, by whom she had the above mentioned Thomas Anlaby, so that my mother was great-granddaughter, here first mentioned Susanna by father and mother." To put way more simply, Susanna Beckwith, the woman who owned the Bible, was the wife of a man called Roger Beckwith, with whom she had 8 children, Marmaduke, Susanna, Arthur, Matthew, Judith, Hester, William, and one child whose name I can't figure out based on what evidence we have. The eldest daughter, Susanna, who she dedicates the Bible to, had a child named Thomas. Thomas married a woman called Susan Parker, who was the daughter of Susanna's sister Judith, and therefore his first cousin. Their daughter was Arthur Onslow's mother, making her Susanna's Beckwith's great-granddaughter on both sides. So it's very much a family Bible. Written on New Testament Folio 1 recto above the printer's note to the reader is a note from Thomas Anlaby himself, reading, "Bequeathed to me by my dear grandmother, Susanna Beckwith, TA." This is different to any other instances of marginalia in communal or family books, where various readers would write their own names to claim ownership of a text over a number of years or even centuries in some cases. We might expect him to have written something more like Thomas Anlaby, his book, and the date in which he received it. Julie Crawford argues that the best way to think about marginalia is less as traces of individual reading than as traces of reading under a name, of a person, a family, a household, a faction, a cause. For the Beckwith family, this name was almost invariably Susanna's. The later readers take care to note that this text belonged primarily to her, regardless of when it was given to them. Susanna is clearly the focal point for this text within the Beckwith family. This was her property, and she decided when and to whom she should bequeath it. Susanna herself is very clear of who her intended audience was, her eldest daughter, Susanna. As noted by Onslow, at the end of the Apocrypha, she writes, "Susanna Beckwith, my dear child, I leave this book as the best jewel I have. Read it with a zealous heart to understand truly, and upon all thou readest, either to confirm thy faith or to increase thy repentance. Be not weary of well-doing, for in due season thou shalt reap if thou faint not. Be not high-minded, but make thyself unequal unto them of the lower sort, as Lord Jesus Christ himself, and God even our Father, which has loved us, and hath given us everlasting consolation and good hope through grace. Comfort thy heart and stabilize thee in eerie good work, and work to the ways of God and patient waiting for our Christ his coming. Come, Lord Jesus, come quickly, for thy servant I am willing. Help my unwilling, SB." Not only a touching note from mother to daughter, this also gives instructions on how to read the Bible and advice on its practical application in life. Femke Molkamp, who's written a little on this marginalia, argues that Susanna emphasizes a prayerful, meditative reading of the Bible and the application of faith to unlock the meaning of scriptures. Here, Susanna demonstrates the interpretive skills in her reading, often ascribed by critics of the typical scholarly male reader. In a time where women's literacy was both relatively uncommon and highly contested, Susanna not only engages in critical analysis of a text, she encourages her daughter to do the same. There is evidence that Susanna's eldest daughter read this text. The initials SB feature frequently throughout this text, both in the same handwriting as Susanna herself and a different hand, most likely belonging to her daughter, presumably marking out sections of the text that are of particular significance to them. The hands are distinct enough that I'm comfortable arguing they belong to 2 different women. Susanna signs her above note with small, neat letters, also seen at various points throughout the text, as you can see here. And her daughter sometimes writes her full name. and sometimes favors the more decorative signature seen here, possibly intended to distinguish her initials from her mother's, possibly due to a generational difference in handwriting practice. In a gesture typical of the period, Susanna also writes the names and dates of birth of all her children on various pages throughout the Bible, often next to a reference to birth or motherhood. So here is Susanna's date of birth next to a reference to Moses and the children of Israel, and William's date of birth next to the line, as one whom his mother comforteth. This suggests that the Bible was used throughout the children's childhoods, and that Susanna viewed this text as an appropriate space within which to make a record of her new family members and future readers. Despite intending the Bible to be a gift for her eldest daughter, it is clear that all the Beckwith's children had access to this text and were encouraged to make their own marks on it. Susanna, the daughter, includes similarly typical marginalia, numbering each of the Psalms and noting which is for morning and which is for evening prayer, so morn 30 and even 30. Arthur, Matthew, and Judith have all also signed their initials at various points, AB, MB, and JB, with Arthur and Matthew both claiming ownership over Proverbs chapter 3 and 6 respectively as Arthur Beckwith's chapter and Matthew Beckwith's chapter. As argued by Mollkamp, Susanna endorses the status of the Bible as a family heirloom, along with the place of literate women in Protestant reading culture, bequeathing the Bible to her daughter and providing advice for its reading. Susanna demonstrates through her own example that this was not just a cursory passing on of a treasured item from mother to daughter, but a practical instruction on how to read a text and apply its spiritual teachings to her own life, instructions that evidently her children did seek to follow. One of the central concerns of women's marginalia studies during the early modern period is the quest for the ordinary reader, one whose reading practices were not enabled by her social position as royalty or aristocracy. We can see through Onsal's note that Susanna was a noblewoman and as such had far more access to literary education than the majority of 16th century women. The only reason we even have access to this Bible at all is because of the status of her great-great-grandson. However, as far as early modern female readers go, Susanna is relatively unknown. This was not the work of a great literary patron or book collector, and she certainly would not have had access to the kind of great humanist education enjoyed by royal women like Elizabeth I or Mary Queen of Scots. Susanna and her daughters, however, could not only read, they could write in clear italic hand and make commentary on the things they had read. I'm not suggesting here that Susanna's actions were wildly out of the ordinary for early modern women. The Bible was certainly not off limits for women to read. What is of particular interest, however, is that Susanna has taken an active role in the religious education of her children, giving them moral instruction in a way that Mollkamp argues was a typical feature of mothers' advice books that abounded in the print market of this period. Just as these advice books were often left as mothers' legacies to their children in the event of their death, Susanna's annotated Bible similarly demonstrates a desire for her religious guidance to pass on to her children. It is this example of a family Bible passing through the matrilineal line for over a century that I believe demonstrates the way in which women's reading and education functioned during the early modern period. Susanna Beckwith did not read her Bible as a solitary act, making notes for her own reference. Evidently, she passed her interpretative skills onto her children, encouraging them to make their own readings of scripture and record them for future readers on the pages of this text. The use of this Bible demonstrates the centrality of women in the family unit, particularly when it came to the affairs of their children. It is this central position that enables early modern women to participate in certain aspects of family politics, such as marriage arrangements, gift giving, and inheritance. James Daybell describes women's role within the aristocratic family as lifelong careers, ensuring the survival and prosperity of their husbands' patrilineages. We know that this Bible did stay in the family until 1768, ensuring Susanna's status as a central family figure or matriarch almost 100 years after her death in 1670. Susanna's husband Roger died nearly 4 decades before her and only 11 years after their last child was born. So it's possible to speculate that the sharing of this Bible was one way of ensuring the closeness of the family unit in the absence of a patriarch. As scholars of women's marginalia studies seek to uncover women's reading practices on a wider scope, texts like family Bibles give some insight into not only what women read, but how they developed interpretative skills that potentially enabled them to participate in wider literary and political culture. One of the arguments surrounding women's education during this period is that it was intended to prepare women for participation in family life. Even for a woman as literate as Susanna, her use of this Bible to provide and encourage religious and literary commentary for her children proves that whatever education she did receive did exactly that.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That was fantastic talk and quite illuminating. I'm sure everyone will have lots of questions about that, but as I say, we will leave those to after everyone has given their paper. Thank you. Okay, so we will move on now to Sarah O'Brien. Sarah is a lecturer in oral history in Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, and her research focuses on memory, gender, and place in the Irish diaspora. Previous studies include an oral history of the Irish in Argentina and a study of the effect of Irish Republican terrorism on Irish immigrants in 1970s Britain. Her most recent book, Of Memory and the Misplaced, published by Indiana University Press, explores the personal life writing of Irish immigrant women in the United States. And her paper today, as you can see, is called Memoir as a Site of Family Work, a case study of Irish immigrant memoirs written in the United States, 1900 to 1970. So thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Joanne. It's lovely to be here. And thanks to everybody for coming along. The time is limited, so I'm just going to jump straight into this. The image that you see there on your right is a literary sort of depiction of one of the women that I'm going to be speaking about today. Her name was Nora O'Connor. Like all the women that I studied, she was an Irish immigrant who left Ireland for the United States at the beginning of the 19th century. And like all of the women that I study, she was one of several who wrote a memoir during her life. And these memoirs have become the focus of my research. I have a collection of 34 memoirs in my possession now, and I've been poring over these for the last 5 years. I suppose my theoretical field of study is collective and cultural memory. And I was interested in how these memoirs written by quite marginalized working class immigrant Irish people could shine light on the sort of the popular memory narratives that we associate with Irish immigration. So we tend to think of memories relating to Irish immigration as kind of hinging on the famine, colonialism, exile, nationalism, and so on. And so I wanted to interrogate these memories to see if there was something else there, if there were other memory narratives, especially relating to women, that had not been recognised. And I guess the book has been pretty successful in saying that, yes, there are patterns of memory here. When you look at women's writing that haven't been absorbed into the popular memory narrative of Irish immigration. So that's been quite satisfying. In terms of today's talk, I'm going to get to Nora O'Connor and hopefully to another woman called Mary O'Mahony. And so I'll give you a little bit of microscopic details of their lives before sort of zooming out and giving you a little bit, I guess, kind of telescopic overview of the findings of this research. It's worth, I suppose, adding or providing a little bit of context around autobiography or memoir. The terms can be used interchangeably, somewhat problematically, but the genre of autobiography is not something that's in any way indigenous to 19th or 20th century Ireland. There actually seems to be an aversion within Irish oral culture to any sort of a narrative that centers on the self. So, in our musical tradition or oral tradition, it was frowned upon to tell a story about yourself. You always told stories about other people. And sort of the identity even of the poet or the singer is often hidden. And so autobiography, or this tendency to write one's memoir, is very much something that these Irish immigrants tended to pick up in the United States, which, at the beginning of the, during the 19th century, really since the publication of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, which remains a bestseller, memoir and autobiography just has a huge cultural presence in the United States. And by the beginning of the 20th century, you're seeing immigrant memoirs in particular being really widely accessible. So they're often serialized in popular magazines. They're often sold at train stations and ports and sort of these locations where immigrants are pouring in. And so they're almost used as manuals for newly arriving immigrants as to how to make it in America, and crucially, how to become a the perfect American. So they are sort of assimilative, I don't want to use the word propaganda, but documentation to a certain extent. They have their own tropes, but it's something that's very much present within the culture of the early 20th century. And you can see that, you know, when I was first looking at that collection of memoirs, you can very much trace their origin back to, I suppose, an American tendency to self-chronicle. So we're going to jump to Nora O'Connor. Of all of the 34 memoirs, I unapologetically favour Nora more than them all. She's an extraordinary writer. Like most of these women, she's from a working class background. So this is a picture of her home in Bantry in County Cork. It's right on the coast. So she was born in 1885 into quite a poor family. Her father was in the British Army, but he died when she was quite young. He was killed in an accident. So Nora had to leave school at 15. She was clearly very artistic and creative, and you can tell that in her writing. She played music and she was quite poetic, and her writing is really touching. So she left school at 15 and she became a servant in Bantry House, which is owned by an Anglo-Irish family called the Lee Whites. Now, this was a time of extraordinary happiness in Nora's life. She loved the atmosphere of Bantry House. She had a very close relationship with the lady of the house, Mrs. Lee White, who wasn't actually much older than her. And she had a sweetheart. She writes about him, Jim Hazel, who, you know, they'd go for walks along the coast road every day. And so it's kind of an idyllic period in her life. And then suddenly this sort of rupture happens where her Nora's own mother, Bridget, forces her to emigrate to the United States. Now, this is a time when immigration does just seem to be a part of the life course in Ireland, especially for young women. But it is unusual that Nora, you know, had a pretty solid life. She was actually providing financially for her family. And it seems that it was, you know, the reason her mother forced her to leave was because Nora's younger brother, Dennis, wanted to go to America to join his siblings over there. And Nora's mother didn't want him to go on his own. So she essentially forced Nora to sacrifice her own future and happiness in Ireland to accompany her younger brother to America. So it's quite tragic, really. And what really interests me about this particular narrative is how it upends all of the stereotypes about Irish immigration being a product of colonialism and, you know, sort of an exile forced by sort of a British presence. Because actually when Nora goes to hand in her notice to Bantry House, Mrs. Lee White fights really, really hard to try and get her to stay. So you have this inversion of roles where it's Nora's Irish mother who's forcing her to leave, and it's the English woman who's trying to get her to stay. It's, you know, you couldn't project that onto the totality of the memoirs, but it is representative of how these personal, intimate narratives kind of trouble the broader history of immigration. Just in terms of, I suppose, inheritance and family lines and what these memoirs mean, it is, like most of the memoirs written by women, it's obvious that women write these for their children and their grandchildren. So very often in the opening of the memoirs, the writers are addressing their children or their grandchildren, or they see the writing as a gesture they do see it as a form of inheritance for their children and grandchildren. And I think that's especially important for immigrant women because they're constantly trying to translate their own culture, their Irish heritage back to children who are born and raised in the United States and really have no conceptualization of what Ireland is. So I see them as acts of inheritance, but also as acts of translation. And the two are very kind of much intertwined. So this is a quote here. So Nora is saying, you know, she mentions that it's her daughter Eileen who said, "Mom, why don't you write down the story of your life?" And I find the last line here really telling. She said, "Why not? The children will know what kind of mother they had, the real me." And in the rest of her memoir, she does focus on the time of her life before she had children. And it's very obvious that she's trying to relay to her daughters even though she was born in Ireland into a poor family and they're American and they don't really make it, they're not wealthy, but she's trying to constantly show parallels between her youth and her dreams and aspirations and those of her daughters. So there's there's an intimacy and a search for proximity between the two generations' lives that I see almost constantly in women's memoirs. In terms of the inheritance and the kind of the passing down, I thought these were kind of insightful as well. So when I got this memoir, there was a letter at the top of it, and it was by this woman, Mary Ellen McGarry, and this was written in 1997. And she, I think, was the wife of the grandnephew of Nora O'Connor. So they inherited a copy of the memoir, and she took it upon herself to type it up and to submit it to a local archive in Minnesota. And that's how it got to me through an American scholar. So you can see here from this quote how much it means to her and to the family, and it continues to be an important family heirloom. This extended into another generation, so I was able to make contact with Mary Ellen in 2020 as I was going through the research, and so she sent me this nice letter, and you can still see how relevant it is to her and to the family. She also mentioned that she went to Bantry House with her late husband and gave them a copy of the memoir, which I was intrigued by. And so I did a little bit of investigation, and I called Bantry House. This was during the pandemic. And as it turns out, they not only had the memoir, they couldn't remember where they had got it, but they had turned it into this cute little book, My Life at Bantry House. And they worked with an artist who none of us have pictures of Nora, but they found old photographs from Bantry House's album, and they kind of interspersed it with like this flower that Nora mentioned in the memoir. I'm not such a fan of the kind of the Victorian made picture in the front, but I'm going to overlook it. And the picture that you saw at the very beginning of this presentation is also from that book. So that was a great surprise. And I do think, in a way, I think that the community, that family in Bantry House was a kind of a family for Nora. She was really devastated for the rest of her life at having to leave there. So this is very sentimental, but I love that her story is for sale in the bookshop in Bantry House. Joanne, I've got one more, just one more slide to go through, but I can skip if we're over time.
I think we're probably still okay. So yeah, please do.
Okay, great. So going on to Mary O'Mahony, she's also from County Cork. She was born around 1850 and immigrated actually as a child, as an 11-year-old to Texas. Now, poor Mary O'Mahony, she's also a beautiful writer. She calls her memoir Rolling Echoes. And I find this one really interesting in terms of the family inheritance and the family dynamic as well. So Mary wrote this in 1940, sometime in the 1940s. I'm not quite sure when, but 10 years before, she had helped her father, Henry O'Mahony, to transcribe his memoir. He was going blind, so he couldn't write himself. Now, I don't mind saying this out loud, he was an awful man. He was violent, he was very domineering. He had played an important role in the Irish nationalist movement at the end of the 19th century, and saw himself, like many kind of Irish American men, as kind of very much the hero of his own story, the center of his own narrative. And so she was quite a dutiful, studious daughter. So she transcribed his memoir, which completely erases the children and Mary's mother, and it's very biased and erases all of his really problematic qualities. So 10 years later, Mary produces this extraordinary memoir, and it's very much a corrective to the narrative that her father has produced. She doesn't say that overtly, but the focus, the content, the tone of her memoir is very clearly arguing or trying to subvert this, not just her father's narrative, but a national Irish narrative of kind of masculine nationalism. So she begins, like Mary, by saying, you know, I feel like I need to write because I've got, you know, I've had a lot of experiences and I want to leave those to my grandchildren. So very much an active inheritance. Then, or the second or third page, she openly admits that my father was a rather cold and severe person. His will was not, you know, and basically he was quite abusive to not just to the children, but to his mother as well. Henry was the one, again, who forced the family to immigrate. He was over and back a lot, like a lot of sort of, you know, young Irelanders at the end of the 19th century. They kind of fled into America when it looked problematic politically, and then they come back. So they had this family in Cork. They had a bar, and they had a little pub and a shop in Ballydehob. And when he was away, the mother did an amazing job of running the whole place. She was obviously very popular. She was a musician, and it seems like she had a lovely life when he wasn't around. And then he'd come home and she'd kind of have to scutter off again, and he'd take over. And he never acknowledged the fact that she kept a very successful business going for a long time while he was in the United States. And so the focus of Mary's memoir becomes validating that and reminding the children and grandchildren of the centrality of this woman in their lives. So I think that this one is really significant. Henry talked a lot about his role in the Land League and how he's imprisoned in Kilmainham jail and all that. Now, he never mentions the fact that his wife was also had a really important role in the Land League, which was, you know, kind of an agrarian nationalist movement. So she mentions that quite deliberately, you know, that her mother has a correspondence with John Boyle O'Reilly, who's quite a well-known Irish patriot and so on. So I do feel like these are very purposefully included in order to, like I say, correct what her father has said, and to provide a more female-centered history for the children and grandchildren. And just finally there, I just really love this excerpt again. Something that I find really special about the memoir is that they provide details on an intimate domestic Irish life that is really absent from the sort of the more male-centered narrative. So again, memory narratives of Ireland tend to be located around the rural landscape and farms. And actually, Katie has written a lot about this, about the role of you know, landscape and west of Ireland, thatched cottages and coastal scenes as being very emblematic, whereas these women's memoirs really illuminate interior spaces in a way that we don't see an awful lot. And again, it provides a lovely intimate portrayal of her mother there. So just very quickly, my findings from the overall project. I felt that the female writers surveyed saw themselves as, like I say, cultural translators responsible for demystifying Ireland for members of their family born and raised in the US. Unlike male autobiographers, family life, and this, I haven't really got into this and we can talk about it at the end. I do feel that family life provides its own mnemonic infrastructure for female memoirs. So they're almost remembering through the architecture of their families in a way that men are not. And so it does make me think about memory, the gendered nature of memory, almost in a structural way, and how it hinges on family life. Like I say, memories were strategically recalled to challenge normative family and national narratives about immigration. And I mean, the term that I've come to kind of define these memoirs by is narratives of proximity. So in contrast to popular Irish American memory narratives, which are very much narratives of incline, so it starts bad with the famine and poverty and ends with like Tammany Hall and John F. Kennedy. These memoirs don't do that. They don't have a rags to riches chronicle, and I think that they are best defined as narratives of proximity. So rather than saying, you know, we started bad, we ended up great, these women are drawing upon memories of beloved people to draw the past closer to the present and to ease the pain of separation. So thank you. I hope I didn't go over time.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It was very, very interesting. I love the term narratives of proximity, and yeah, that's just great. Again, as you say, I hope we can talk about that a little bit more. But now I shall move on to our final speaker today, who is Becca Sloan Mather. Becca is a retired Queen Alexandra Royal Army Nursing Corps officer. I had to look that up because it was the abbreviation, so I just wanted to check I had that right. She's currently starting her third year of a PhD in English literature at Cardiff University, and her research focuses on the autograph albums of military nurses from the Great War. Gaining her RGN at Guy's and Lewisham hospitals in London, she then specialised in perioperative practice nursing at St Thomas Hospital in London, and she joined Quarank in 2000 and was later posted to Birmingham City University as part of the then DSH. She retired from service in 2016, returning to perioperative practice before undertaking her PhD. So I will hand over to Rebecca. I'm not entirely sure if everyone can see that all okay. My screen's being a little bit awkward, but do let me know if there's any problems, but otherwise I'll go across.
Right, can everybody see my video okay? Yeah, that's good. Okay, so good morning, everybody. My presentation is going to be looking at aspects of my research into the album entries that are in the main made by the soldiers that the QARNC, or at that time QAIMNS, and VAD nurses cared for on their wards. The albums are a creative space and as such not factual history, but they can add a different perspective to the historical record. The entries are subjective and as such should be viewed as interpretive, impressionist insights into the nursing care of individual soldier patients. Sorry. As a resource, the albums provide valuable and intriguing insights into the interactions between the soldier patients and the nurses. Through these albums, we are allowed to meet the soldiers and feel their presence as they opened the books, read the entries, and contemplated what they would write. The nurses, on the other hand, are shadowy figures, permeating every album, and yet we mostly meet them indirectly. Their voices, however, are occasionally captured in the entries. The albums themselves do provide some details about the nurses and the hospitals they worked in. The soldier patients sometimes refer to the hospitals and wards as you would record an address in a letter at the top of their contributions, and voluntary aid nurse detachment nurses Mary Penn and Violet Herdman added photographs to their patients and the hospitals wards to their albums. This enabled some of the albums to be linked to specific hospitals and even some wards, both in England, France, and Egypt. Entries in Marjorie Russell's album show it was compiled at Pilton House Convalescent Hospital, which was not identified on the Auxiliary Red Cross Hospital list. In contacting Somerset Heritage Museum, archivists confirmed that a local researcher had identified its use in this capacity. Similarly, Mary Penn's album had entries citing Fair Oaks and Park House in Birmingham as her place of work. Again, further research confirmed these locations were part of the first Southern military hospital based at Birmingham University. Other albums contain entries by the soldiers referring to the wards they are on, and in some instances the specialities of that ward. The detail not often found in any of the voluntary aid detachment or QAIMNS nurse records that still exist. Soldiers made reference to their condition, gastritis, mumps, or amputated limbs in their entries, indicating the ward's speciality. And we know from the entries in her album that Sister Lillian Robinson nursed patients with flu and measles towards the end of the war. Most of the albums in the archive are standalone objects, sometimes accompanied by photograph albums and medals, but where there are diaries accompanying the albums, a more in-depth reading of the album is possible. In the case of Sister Lillian Robinson, we have both diaries and autograph album from her time in France. Besides recording her thoughts in a diary, Lillian used her album to express those thoughts, fears, and ambitions in a different medium. The first confirmed contribution in the album by Lillian herself is short, dated the 21st of the 5th, 1915, and initialed LR. And it reads, "I would be true, for there are those who trust me. I would be true, for there are those who care. I would be strong, for there is much to suffer. I would be brave, for there is much to dare. I would be friend of all, then for the friendless. I would be giving, forget the gift. I would be humble. For I know my weakness, I would look up and love the gift. This is Lillian's voice we hear, and the virtues of trust, strength, bravery, humility, and loyalty expressed in the verse suggest they are important to Lillian in her role as a nurse at the front. In a diary entry for December 23rd, 1914, Lillian records her feelings. I feel tonight I want guidance so much, things I can't tell even to you, my diary. What a strange life I am living here. O Father, keep me always near thee and worthy to bring the dying to thee. The verse was entered in her album in January and may have been the guidance she was looking for. A second entry by Lillian in the album is longer at 7 verses and written over 2 pages. It is entitled Ambition and begins, I do not seek a place among the famous, a woman known to all the world by name. For learning, skill, or aptitude in business, not worldly wise, let me attain to fame. Like Lillian's first entry, this verse demonstrates an ethos for the qualities she believes she should strive for as a military nurse caring for wounded soldiers. Sorry. A Royal College of Nursing scrapbook belonging to Beatrice Longmire contains a similar entry about nursing ideals and reality by Nurse Mackay. Here, the idealistic vision of nursing by a nurse at the start of her training is then contrasted with its realities. The thoughts are written in verse, partially for amusement, but also with a seriousness about the hard work involved. In August 1914, Lillian Robinson recorded the arrival of wounded patients in her diary. They arrived at 05:30, tired out, hungry and wounded. We sat them on anything and fed them Bovril and hot milk. We can see this same welcoming routine in an entry in her album from Dougie Atkinson in 1917, who was it first who welcomed me and filled me up with hot beef tea, then pushed me into 23, the sister. Dougie goes on to give us a glimpse of this initial interaction between the nurse and the patient, who gives me just a gentle shake, and while I'm but half awake, proceeds my temperature to take, the sister. And who is she whose chief delight lies in thermometers steely bright and giving gargles day and night, the sister, who dressed in cape of gorgeous red, approaching to my mumpy bed, says, take that muffler off your head, the sister, who said in tones of gentleness, today you may get up and dress, but don't go into the measles mess, the sister. Who is that torture-loving band who'll drive me to the better land, the Mrs. Ale, Lewis, and the sister? And when she dies, shall we hear her voice in heaven, calm and clear, say, take your gargle, Peter dear, I wonder. We hear Lillian's voice in the short interjections of take that muffler off your head, take your gargle, Peter dear, bringing the nurse's voice to life. She is direct, no nonsense. The directions are given almost as an order, and yet the use of the first name and the affectionate dear shows an intimacy with the patient that is in contrast with its description of the nurses as that torture-loving band. Several albums contain entries about night duty. Lieutenant Corley, writing whilst in the 19 General Hospital, Alexandria, captain in ward to Sister Mason on night duty, stealing in the ward at 2 a.m. with a torch. His greeting of, sister, you're the light of the world with that torch, sends him into a kind of reverie, and he links the event with a hymn of the time. Light of the world, faint were our weary feet, with wandering far, but thou didst come our lonely hearts to greet, thou morning star. And thou didst bid me lift my hand to thee, and afterwards said, your pulse is 70. It also demonstrates how the conventions of album writing take something familiar, such as the lines of a hymn, and adapt it by alterations, sometimes quite small, to provide a personal contribution to the album. Lieutenant Corley's reverie is broken as Sister Mason's voice breaks through his thoughts, and we hear her matter-of-fact comment, your pulse is 70, bringing him back to reality. The AD nurse, Marianne Jones, is also working night duty on Ward 5. Lights are out at 9 o'clock and she starts her duty at 9:30. Like Sister Mason, she too carries her small torch. And just as Lieutenant Corley conjures up the Sister Mason as the light of the world, here the imagery is more immediate as Nurse Jones's torch floods our ward with light. These images of light can also be linked to the flashes from the shells and the very lights that the soldiers would have experienced at the front. The nurses' torches, however, are seen here as reassuring. The night sister and O Tarrant provide a contrast between the patient's and the nurse's view of night duty. The night sister is both appreciative and gently critical at the same time, just as Dougie Atkinson described the nurses on his ward as a torture-loving band. This writer describes the sister first as a perfect pest for waking him at 6 a.m. But he follows this up to acknowledge that she is there with soothing words which he was fretful and depressed. An entry in the Voluntary Aid Detachment nurse at Madge White's album contains reference to reassurance on waking to find the nurse there. And as with Marion Jones's entry, the soldier claims ownership with the words, "Our dear little night nurse and our guardians by night." In contrast, O Maiden of the Night is interesting in that at first it seems to describe the arrival of the night nurse at 8 o'clock who comes flying in. Then the writer goes on to describe how he dare not shut his eyes as she would tip him up on the cold floor. It is more likely as describing the fear of closing his eyes and having nightmares, something many soldiers experienced after their time in the trenches, rather than a mysterious nurse. The patients who were fretful at night, possibly in pain or having nightmares, would have kept nurses busy at night. O Tarrant is written by Pratty, a fellow nurse in Sister Tarrant's album. The horrors of night duty and the weariness of the morning would have been a common experience. Cutting bread and writing the report whilst only half awake, and the joy she has when 8 o'clock arrives, signalling the end of her night duty. Even in these few examples, the repeated emphasis on the nurse as the guardian of the night demonstrates the difficulties that many soldier patients had sleeping. Painful wounds and nightmares of their experiences at the front would have impacted many, and perhaps this is one reason that Nurse Tarrant's entry speaks of the horrors of night duty. Finally, I have included some of the soldier art found in the albums, which provides some light-hearted images of the soldier's perception of his nurse and the nursing care. In the first slide, the soldier provides his view of the nurse off duty in her finery and on duty rushing around. The second image shows the battle between the nurse and her patient as she tries to get him to take his medicine. And he is more interested in distracting her with his war stories. Badly hit, condition serious, shows the patient's romantic interest in his nurse. Many entries are suggestive of a hoped-for romance with their nurse. The intimacy of the treatment and care would have, for some patients, been very meaningful. The final image shows a hospital patient in his hospital blues with a VAD nurse offering him quinine extra Mark 1. Although the albums provide commentary on the nurses and their care, interpretation of these entries must be cautious. The aim of the contributions is usually to amuse, and accuracy in the historical context is subject to poetic license. However, they do provide an insight into the regard the soldier patients held their carers and amuse us too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becca. That was fantastic. I particularly like those drawings that the soldiers did. They are just, very beautiful and really do evoke the period and published cartoons and illustrations too. Thank you. So if I could just ask you to stop sharing, that would be fantastic, and we will then be able to open the floor up to questions for everyone. Okay. Shall I think that probably I can see everybody on the screen, but perhaps if you could raise a hand on the screen if you would like to ask a question. Perhaps you'll be happy for me to start us off by going first. I had a question for everyone, but I'll start with Hannah, since Hannah went first. I was absolutely fascinated by this Bible, which was preserved around the woman who made her mark through it, who used it both to instruct and advise her daughters. And interestingly, though, of course, there are men, her sons presumably, who also interacted with it. But as you say, this very direct voice that she shared with her daughter. So I thought that was particularly interesting. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more, because I'm not that familiar with family Bibles, and I expected, as I've seen some of them, to have children's births and sadly deaths and so on in the front of a Bible. I just wondered what these, clearly there's some significance as to why children's births are marked against particular verses, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that for us.
Yeah, of course. I'm not really sure. Obviously, I'm not in her mind. I have no idea why she chose to do what she did. Normally, you do see them written in the front, especially in early modern books. That's why I found this one so interesting. A lot of them are next to references to motherhood. I think Matthew's one is next to a reference to Matthew in the Bible, which was cool. And then I think either Judith or Hester was next to a reference to a queen. So it's not always like specifically about motherhood. It's maybe how she feels about her child or the emotions evoked by the verse while she's reading it. For some reason, it just made her think of her newborn baby. Yeah.
Thank you, Hannah. I mean, I think that even more sort of underscores the role of these artifacts, these objects, as a way of constructing all sorts of identity. I thought that was fantastic insight into that. As I say, please do I see a hand here on my, do I see a hand anywhere? Possibly that was just my own cursor hovering over something. Okay, I shall, while you are considering what you would like to, Katie, I see you have a question.
Well, just to continue on that point about Hannah's book in the Bible, I was quite interested in the giving of the date of birth kind of thing, that way of recording a child as well is quite interesting. And I've been thinking of that because of my account books. It really reminded me of the talk I did a few weeks ago or months ago now on account books, because of the way that you've kind of got the formal record, and then you've also got all this annotation, which is more personal, and the way that births and deaths particularly were quite important in account books, and they were often marked in there alongside these kind of records. And so there's kind of an interesting question there, I think, around sort of early modern people and their need to record births and deaths and marriages, and in a way that I'm not sure us as moderns do. Like, obviously we find those things important, but I don't know that we're all writing in the margins of our Bibles or our account books to remind us of when our children were born, if you see what I mean. And so I'm kind of interested about that sort of that practice and why they're engaging in that sort of record keeping type practice around that. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, but it's an interesting repetition, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's really interesting in terms of, clearly she intended to hand this Bible on. I wonder if maybe they were considering how it might be passed through the generations and how they could create a record for the family that would stay within the family, because the birth records aren't that accurate, really. They only really record Susanna as having 5 or 6 children at some times. The only reason I know why she has 8 is because she's written them all in the Bible. So I guess in that way, especially if the children don't survive, everyone who lives after them will know exactly who it was and what verse of scripture will help create memories of them in that way. So I guess all their descendants will read that verse and be like, oh, my great-great-grandmother had this child and this made her think of them, I guess, in that kind of emotional way.
Thank you, Hannah. I had another question for Sarah, if no one minds me going ahead with that. And again, very interesting, links across all of the talks in the way these are objects which are very much centered on women's identity in various forms. Sarah, I think that the account you gave of Nora's memoir and the way that moved, the way it challenged narrative and then more collectively fits into the way in which women wrote their memoirs and how they are indeed focused on the intimate and the domestic, I think was really revealing. I just had a quick question, which in some ways you actually went on to answer, I think, as the talk went on. But you're looking at memoirs and I was thinking about them as an object. So, you know, you talked about someone who had transcribed or recorded her father's memoir because he wasn't able to at that point in time, and then she typed hers up later on. And then we had a memoir which presumably was in some form that passed through family members before it went to an archive, and then also became another version of it, a sort of more public version. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, you know, or any insights into when that memoir was an object itself, and it's one of the things we're finding, of course, is that at some point, sometimes some of these objects that we're interested in are not just, you know, they're inherited, but then, as we've seen already, they move into a public repository. So yeah, it's just if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Joanne. It's something I'm a little bit blindsided by, because I was lucky enough to be sort of sent the transcribed, the kind of typed up manuscripts from an American scholar, Kirby Miller. So I haven't seen the memoirs in their original format. They are in the process of being digitized at the moment. They've just been submitted to NUIG. So I don't actually have a sense of that, other than what you get in those kind of attached letters and things like that. So I haven't actually seen them. My sense is that they were mostly, you know, like as you say, they go through processes of evolution. They start out as handwritten manuscripts that are rolled up in the attic, and somewhere, like, they all owe a debt of gratitude to some family member who recognizes their value and passes them on to a local archive, a local historical archive. In some cases, we were able to find these memoirs because Kirby Miller, who wrote a pretty famous book called Immigrants and Exiles in the 1980s, put ads in Irish American newspapers over about a 3-year period, asking for memoirs and letters to be submitted. So that's how they kind of came to him. But the answer to your question is I don't actually know. I haven't seen them, and I think it would add a whole other dimension to the research. I sometimes lie in bed and think about what they originally looked like, but not there yet. But I think it's a great question.
Thank you, Sarah. And of course, that just interesting also insofar as, you know, we ought to start, well, I'm sure somebody's already doing this, but looking at the 1980s as you know, why is the 1980s when everybody starts to put those ads in, or, you know, lots of scholars put those ads in papers saying, tell us about, you know, your lives, because I mean, that's the Burnett archive, you know, working class autobiographies as well, I guess. Well, if no one else minds, I will go for a full house here. Oh, Katie, go ahead. And I think I saw Renska then too.
I'm just going to come on and Sarah as well about the thing that I loved was the person who wrote a memoir, the man, and then they write the women's version because they're so annoyed. And this is so familiar because my grandfather wrote a memoir and my grandmother's not in it, and everybody in the family is furious about this. And so it will entirely not surprise me at all that at some point one of my aunts or, you know, is going to write their own version of my grandmother's life because they're just so angry at my grandfather for writing this story that she's not in. So that felt very familiar and very hilarious. But I was just kind of interested in that dynamic as well, in the way that, like, in a similar way, you have these objects that kind of are taken into different forms through different generations, but then also the way that they're reformed, I guess, by a new generation who writes their own version of events or who wishes to contest those events, which is a different way of kind of continuing the narrative, but also, you know, doing something different with it. But, yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what's really ironic about Mary O'Mahony? I feel like she's totally taken up with the kind of the shadow of her father or her own life. But she goes on to have her own husband and her own children, but she doesn't mention them at all in her memoir. So in this weird way, it's like history repeating itself, where she's getting her own back at her dad, but then she's kind of doing the same thing to the next generation of her. Like, she is writing to her grandchildren, but she kind of erases her husband as well. So yeah, it's so cyclical. It's yeah, it's really madly interesting. And I do think though it's different. Like, I do not see Irish women in Ireland doing that kind of a counter narrative thing. You know, they're very much upholding the memories of James Connolly and the Irish nationalists, and they see that as their duty as daughters to reinforce the nationalist narrative. Whereas the Irish immigrant women in America are like, no, we're not doing that. We're going to shine some deadly light on this kind of family portrait. So just that.
Thank you. Renska, I think you raised a hand. Please go ahead.
I also had a question for Hannah. I was also very interested in those notes throughout the Bible text, almost as if she sort of integrates herself within the book rather than just on its outsides. And I was wondering if it might have something to do with a certain awareness of the materiality of the book and the fact that these fly leaves and ant leaves have so often been removed through time and sort of got lost, whilst sort of the book block and the actual text is more stable in a sense. Because I study Dutch Bibles and ownership and marginalia, and I have never seen this either. So I think it's intriguing why it's in there, and yeah, I was also wondering whether her children sort of respond to her notes, or do they sort of search for their own spaces within the book?
That's a really good point. Thank you for your question. So they were kind of taught when they were educated that they should be responding to books in this way, and they should be making notes. It was part of humanist education. Everyone should be taught in their own language, and they should have a response to what they've read. More often men were taught to do that. So I don't know whether she had that kind of education and they taught her how to do it, or if she was imitating another family member, if she just, it's not that hard to come up with doing it yourself. I'm not sure, but because books were such an expensive commodity, I think they thought they couldn't imagine that someone would just like get rid of a book and get a new copy. Like, I think they intended that these books were going to be kept for a long time. So I think to write on it was to show ownership of it and be like, this is mine and these are my thoughts. But also they intended for people to see these for many, many years afterwards. And I think that's why you see more instances of it, maybe. What was your other question? I'm sorry. Oh, the children. So the marginalia it's pretty consistent all the way throughout. They don't really respond to each other. The only instance I really see where they interact with each other is where William's name is written next to us, one whom his mother comforted. It looks like one of the other children has like drawn a manicure, like a hand pointing towards it, kind of like they're making fun of him, which I thought was nice. But I think they're not really carving out their own spaces because it's all pretty interspersed quite evenly throughout. But I think they're all occupying this space together, and they all feel a certain authority to be able to be like, this is important to me, this was important to you, stuff like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's an intriguing source. Thank you so much.
I think we've got, I think Alison and Cherish and Carmen have their hands raised. I think Alison and Cherish had their hands raised first, but I'm not entirely sure which order. So I'm going to go alphabetically and go Alison, Cherish, and Carmen, because I saw you came up a little bit later. So we'll go in that order, please.
I'm not very good at these things. Thank you. All those talks are absolutely fascinating, and they're very relevant to me. I'm doing a paper next week, and one thing I have to comment on is the excitement that I think Sarah said about the immediacy of an original document. You get excited when you actually look at something that somebody wrote all those years ago, and it makes them a real person. I find that absolutely fascinating. But my question really was to Becca. Did you chase through any of the nurses after the war to see if they continued on into nursing, or whether they married any of the soldiers, or have you done any of that, or are you going to do any of that?
It's not a specific focus because it's the content of the books are more the focus, but finding out about the nurses and their lives, yes, that will come out in some of the nursing records. Sometimes there's very little out there, so you're chasing down in ancestry, so you're reliant very much on the censuses. So things like, for me, next year's release of the 1921 census will be very important to do that. You don't get a huge amount of information to get unless you've got diaries and other stuff that encapsulates their life. The military nurses, sometimes you do see them going on. Lillian Robinson, she had a very interesting career. She even nursed in the Second World War and everything. So yeah, you will find that in some of those more substantial records. The VADs, this is down to, you know, literally the genealogy sites and things. I'm currently following up a nurse called Violet Herdman, and you do come across things occasionally. You find on Ancestry somebody's done a tree related to somebody in there, so I've got emails flying off to various people, so I may gain something back about them. But in many ways they're quite an invisible presence there, and they're there but they're not there because it's all the soldiers doing the writing about them. And certainly the section I'm looking at the moment is interesting because, as I said, it is delving a bit more into their lives and their background to try and give a bit of meat on the bones. But that's quite rare. You don't see too much of them in the books themselves. Lillian is unusual. She's actually written in her books. You know, I'm not finding that as a much throughout the rest of the books that the nurses actually write in there. It's the soldiers writing about them and their interaction.
Thank you.
Thank you. So shall we go to Cherish now?
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for such fascinating papers that have been so sort of wide-ranging and thought-provoking. I also have a question for Rebecca. And I wondered if you'd come across any references in the diaries to the process of making the autograph books, or if there were any kind of broader conversations going on in newspapers or print media at the time that kind of sheds a bit more of a light on the process of creating them.
Yeah, as part of my PhD, my last chapter was kind of focusing on how this came about, and I kind of referred a little bit, very briefly, to the fact that often that the books that when they were given to them, and they would spend hours, I think, reading through these books, because you see entries that have been taken, lifted, and then changed to make them unique to them. So you do see that element of plagiarism to a degree within the books going on. There's I looked at the particularly there's been some research done on the American autograph books pre the post-penum and antebellum periods in America, and there is a bit of a convention going on there that the books were done very much as in that period when people particularly girls, they left school and it was that sort of parting of the way, so the books were handed around. There is a similar example of Princeton University, where again at the end of their college years, these books were passed around as a way of keeping these books. And there are certain verses that reflect the annoyance of having to do it, and also the fact that, you know, they are worried that they are not going to produce something original for the person because they hold them in that regard and they want to be remembered. But there's an acknowledgement they probably won't be, particularly back in those periods of time they were. And again, I think that's pertinent to the military World War I books. Often these soldier patients were nursed and sent back to the front. Lillian Robinson, in the start of her book, has a very interesting list of names of soldiers that she nursed, some of whom I've been able to trace down and find that they were actually killed not long after leaving her nursing care because they went back to the front. So some of it's quite poignant, but yeah, there is stuff. And also you will see a lot of stuff in terms of the in the newspapers, in terms of the advertisement of autograph books, and it was a very popular thing, and they used to get famous people to sign these autograph books and then auction them for, you know, funds for particularly for the war.
Lovely, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now Carmen.
questions for both Sarah and about the Bibles. Sarah, were most of those memoirs written with the intention that they would become public, that they would go in to be read by a broader set of people? You talk about them communicating to the families and creating this communication between the generations and translating culture, but were they intended to be read by more than just the immediate family?
Oh, it's such a great question. Really difficult to know, and and there's a gender divide here. You can see with the men's memoirs that I've been looking at that they do have a sense of the right to publication, or that because they're so depersonalized, you feel like they probably did think that they had, and the material, you know, that they cover their like role in the Irish nationalist movement. So you kind of think, oh yeah, they were totally hedging for a publication here, and it didn't happen. But the women don't tend to do that. So I do feel like of most of the female memoirs that I've been looking at, I don't think they had that intention. Maybe it's something privately that they harbored, but and then again, the writing is so intentional, and some of the memoirs are over 100 pages long. You know, they're very complete, they're very edited, they have these beautiful, you know, chapter headings and subheadings. And so there's a part of me that feels like their humility as working class immigrants, I think they would have felt like it would have been audacious to think about publication. But then like I say, the intentionality, you would wonder. You would actually wonder if yeah, but there's no evidence of them trying to seek out a publisher or anything like that. It's a great question. I often think about it.
And this Renesk, I'm not going to say your name correctly. I'm curious about the Bibles. They're objects that have conventions around them, even now, about writing or not writing in them. So were there cultural prohibitions, especially in those early periods when books were a fairly rare item that were very expensive, about writing in them? I mean, you say that you've only seen this once, and that they tend to be constrained to the backs and fronts where it's a very specific set of things that they're entering. But you also talk about how they were being trained to be reflective and critical, and how this was part of that process. So where was that process usually happening? If it's not usually in the margins, where would it have gone? Where would we find the records of those thought processes and that way of looking and passing on the ways of thinking about this part of their life? I suppose that's not a terribly clear question in some ways, but I want an answer now.
No, it's fine. It's not that I've only seen it once. It's that it's really uncommon for it to be so spread out like this, and also for us to know who wrote what part. Wow. Especially most of the time there's no name attached, and when there's no name attached, you kind of just assume that it's a man, because it is more likely to be a man. But it's kind of annoying when you're trying to create like a database of like all the instances of women doing this. I'm not really sure where they would have recorded this if it wasn't in the margins. They certainly practiced doing things like this in school, especially boys. They were taught like classics, they were taught rhetoric, they were taught how to respond to ideas in this way. So I guess it would have happened during school practice. The interesting thing with women is a lot of the time, especially when they read the Bible, it was either read aloud to them while they were sewing or doing some other kind of domestic task, or they sang the Psalms together or things like that. People were literate in a different way. They couldn't always read something, but obviously they could hear it and understand, or if they could read, they couldn't often write. So it's kind of difficult to reconstruct how they read things and how they interpreted text in that way. My kind of theory is that they had like the practice down, they could read the Bible and they could form their own opinions on it, but we don't always have evidence of how that happened or how they thought of it themselves, and B, it's hard to gauge just how much this would allow them to like have critical analysis of a literary text or have really well-formed opinions on politics in that way. So I guess just trying to figure, it's just a kind of a process of trying to figure out how much were they aware of that this was what they were doing. They were interpreting a text and having a certain level of analysis over it, or whether it was just, I live in a religious culture and I like to live in a spiritual way.
So do you feel that there was any prohibition against marking this holy book? Have you seen any indication, male or female, that there was a limiter on what you would do to a book as far as marking it, a Bible specifically?
I don't think so. They were encouraged to write on things a lot. The thing with Bibles is because they were so expensive and a lot of them were like presentation copies, like, look at this amazing Bible I have. They probably wouldn't have written on it just because they want to preserve it and make it like a perfect kind of text in that way. There wasn't any kind of, you shouldn't write on this because it's a spiritual text. They would have been encouraged to do that. It would have been seen as a good thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder about, I don't really know the history of commonplace books, but and quite how early they begin. But I guess that would be another place where some of that sort of reflection, perhaps, and indeed critical thinking would on late 17th, early 18th century examples of that. I'm scanning my screen here for others who might have questions. Katie mentioned also, and Metzger has another comment on that discussion there in the chat. But I think Katie made a point about modesty as a trope through women's writings, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've got lots of different types of women's writing here, where from women who are presenting themselves as mothers to women who are looking, or who are being presented perhaps as idealized women by this point in the public sphere. So it's quite an interesting range. But yes, that sort of that trope, I think, is common throughout. I'm passing you here, Katie, but I'm sure you'd be able, if you wanted to form a question around that, shall I hand across to you?
I was just thinking that, that so that's a very known thing for women who wanted to write in the early modern period, is they would go, never intended this for publication, it was for my children, it was only for my children. And then, oh, accidentally it got published 300 times and became a bestseller. How did that happen? It was so innocent. So that really reminded me of that in the memoir story, that women weren't allowed to publish, and so they created those what we call modesty tropes, and that's very well, I guess, studied. But yeah, I think it's a good point about how gender is such an important way of shaping how we are allowed to construct ourselves. And the nursing example is great for that, right? You've got them in their fancy clothes and you've got them in their nursing caring, and they can be kind of sexy if, because they might be fancied by their doctors, or they might be stern and cruel, but there's still a very strong gendered representation of women there, yeah. And no male nurses that we're seeing, or those kind of things. So I think that gets those limitations and boundaries around how we imagine what women can be, and how they can imagine themselves. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, could I just add to that? Yeah, there's a really great book edited by Margot Colley about women, American women's autobiography, and she does talk a lot about the gendered signature and how most women's autobiographies kind of start with the sort of this sense of autobiography as a duty as a woman to pass on experiences to other women. So it's very much, I'm a mother, or I'm an immigrant, or whatever it is. And as a woman, I feel like this is a gift. This is almost like a gift to other women, or a kind of a duty of care to other women, to let them know what I know. So it's another way of decentering themselves, really, and then putting their gender and their experiences before their own identity as authors, and using that as a kind of a shell to validate the audacity of them writing about themselves. Yeah, just wanted to put that in.
Thank you. So absolutely very relevant observation. I have a quick question for Becca myself, because partly again it's a very similar question to what I've asked the other speakers. I just wondered who owned the albums. So did the albums stay with individual nurses? So they were kind of albums. I'm just trying to get at the not just the sort of broader practice of this, and how fashionable it was, perhaps, and often it's interestingly that the other examples that were given there were unmarried women or young women. And yeah, so I just wondered, are these albums that the nurses themselves would go in to the wards with and they distribute it to the soldiers they were nursing, and then did they keep it? Did it stay in their families? Was it something, did you know of any that became an artifact which said something about that woman? Although I know, as you say, that they are sort of invisible to these women.
Yeah. No, the autograph books in the main have either been the ones I'm looking at are a collection at the Museum of Military Medicine. So they have either been donated by QAIMNS nurses from the First World War and Second World War and onwards, or they have been collected because they're of interest through auction. There's a lot going through auction, and they fetch huge sums of money and everything. The collection I'm looking at, there's about, I think I've got a collection of about 26 books that they're allowing me to research, and then there's a few on the RCN website as well. Yeah, no, the impression is that these books were in the ownership of the nurse. They'll often write their names in the front of the book. That's as much as you know who it is. There's sometimes, because most of the soldiers refer to them as the sister or the nurse, so you don't tend to get a first name or a second name in that song unless they put that in there. Some of them are almost impossible to chase up. So yeah, I've got one book, Marjorie Russell's book, and it's almost like she's taken it in when they've had, you know, a whole load of soldiers coming in or about to leave. It sounds like they're coming in, and you can almost feel this book being passed down the row of all these soldiers as a means perhaps to keep them occupied while they're looking at other soldiers, you know, sort of perhaps getting them into their beds and things. So you do wonder if there's an element of keeping them quiet. And also I think with some of the books, possibly when they pass them around, they may be being passed to favourite soldiers, you know, that they've cared for. One of the invisible things I think in the books is that you don't get a sense of whether there were soldiers they nursed that they deliberately didn't want the book to go to, so potential malingerers that were on the wards and things like that. So yeah, there's some things that are quite intriguing about the environment of the ward that they tell you and then don't tell you.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Another example of sort of the decentering of the woman who is actually at the centre of this, yeah. and you know, quite fascinating. Katie.
I was also thinking some of them are remarkably good, right? Like some of the poetry is very effective, some of the art is like just very talented, and you're going to imagine that your average soldier probably isn't a talented poet or artist, even though there will be them. And so then you're also wondering, was there a kind of selection around competence, shall we say, like this person seems to be a talented or is a known poet, for example, that, you know, you obviously would have got kind of famous people coming in through the troops just like anyone else, and whether they're kind of picking for people where they think they'll get a nice piece of art out of them. That's kind of,
yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, one of the things that I'm kind of trying to chase down at the moment is looking at hospital magazines, is where they are getting this information from. Is this something they have actually, you know, created themselves? Some people have actually said that they've done this themselves, and you get a sense that it's unique. But looking at hospital magazines, looking at current sort of literature of the day, quite a few of the verses you can trace back to hymns that they've known. The one I quoted for Lieutenant Corley, I chased that. That was an interesting find because I chased that down. That was written specifically for a Methodist church in Manchester in about 1902. And I chased down that Lieutenant Corley was a primitive Methodist from Manchester. So you do wonder if this was a verse that really had such a lot of deep meaning for him. And everything, possibly sung at his church quite regularly. So you do get things like that being, you know, sort of, and then like in that one, sort of slightly altered to make it unique, you know, changes that last line to your pulse is 70, you know. So yeah, that's interesting questions.
It's interesting actually, because at Oxford Books we have the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History, and they are promoting some of the materials in their archive. And actually they have they used to have the Westminster Trust, which was a teaching college. It's interesting that they have an album which is effectively one of the, like the American autograph albums that you were talking about there, where someone who is sort of in education and leaving will gather you know, their peers together and construct this album out of that. And I do wonder if there may even be something Methodist about feeding into this kind of practice too.
I was going to make a comment just along the same sort of lines. As you'll find out next week, I've got a family archive that I'm discussing, but in there's an autograph book which looks almost identical on the cover to the ones that you showed, Becca. And it's my great aunt, my grandfather was in the war, but this is my great aunt, but she wasn't involved in the war, but I think it must date from about that period. And they were very strong Baptists. They were something called the Church of Christ. And this little book is all, I don't know who, I know who a lot of the names are because I know them through family stories, but it's very, very similar, not in a war setting, to the books that you've got. And there's some beautiful little watercolors in there, obviously done by her friends. And there's a poem written by her brother, my great uncle, who was known for being very cynical. And it's based on a hymn from the church about Millie, my great aunt. So it obviously dates from about that period. She was the younger sister of 3 children. So I find it fascinating, just the actual object you've got, because it sort of answers a lot of questions about where did my little autograph, and obviously it was fashionable for 16-year-old girls to do them at that time.
And they are all 6x4 inch, with approximately 100 to 120 pages, of different colours all the way through.
And there's repeating things that I can remember from my childhood. There was a fashion in the 60s for autograph books where you fold over the corner of the page and it says, for ladies only, and you open it up and it says, aren't men nosy? Underneath.
That's an interesting one, because I've got 1 or 2 books that have had sewing needles stuck through the pages. The rest of the sewing needles are still there. Bits of cord knotted, with some kind of trope that's there. A cigarette's even been put in and sewn into the page. It's interesting how they will put objects into these. Not very often, but they are there. And the typical trope of by hook or by crook, or roses are red, that will appear in almost every book. Literally.
Yeah,
and to this day, I think we still use those.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes left, so Katie, did you want to come in there?
I have one of these albums as well, and I got it from my grandmother, but it wasn't hers. But it seems to be in the family. But she never really clearly explained to me where she got it from either. But same book, same format. The Roses are Red thing, that's in there a couple of times. So it definitely was part of that fashionable moment. But actually, the point I was thinking of as we were having this discussion was the way that family objects, perhaps because so many families do the same things, then become a moment of familiarity and enable certain types of conversation to happen, say, across us as a group, but perhaps also more widely, moments of recognition, so people have family Bibles, and so then you talk about that and it finds a moment. And so we often think about family inheritances as goods that create lineages that go up and down, but we might also think about them as goods that actually help people find, I guess, relationships across and between families, which is kind of interesting.
And just to draw everybody's attention, there's a couple of comments in the chat. So Jane asks if there's possibly a class-based element in terms of the types of people, nurses and patients represented within each autograph book. So yes, indeed, that might well be significant, I guess, for you, Becca. And Helen says that she has an autograph book of soldiers' World War I autographs belonging to her grandmother. That's fantastic. So Becca, you might want to talk to Helen Corlett there. So that looks like a great connection. There you are, Helen. I don't know. Yes. So I think that the chat is saved as part of my Zoom recording. But if anybody wants to follow up any of this and we get stuck, just email me, email Inheriting the Family email, which is also on the website, and Katie, and we will sort this out. Okie dokie. Well, we're at 10:30. And so we'll probably draw to a close, but can we all thank our wonderful speakers and their fantastic talks today. So thank you very much to Hannah, Sarah and Becca. can I just remind anyone who might not know at the moment that on Thursday, the 21st of October, we have another session, and the theme of that will be family archives, emotional and physical displacement. We're picking up one of the themes that we've noticed before in the way, what happens to these objects when they lose their original family, or family members discover them and there are things in them that are surprising, sometimes unpleasant, challenging. We're going to talk about some of those things. So if you haven't already registered and you can attend, please do. But I will close the meeting now. But again, thank you so much for coming along, and it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.